Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into a topic that's, well, pretty chilly, even though we're talking about Latin America.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to look at how the Cold War impacted the art scene in Latin America, specifically between 1945 and 1952.
Interesting period. A lot of tension, a lot of change.
Right. And we've got this lecture essay. Actually, it was meant for IB/DP history students, but...
Always a good sign those IB essays get into the good stuff.
Exactly. And this one really unpacks how artists basically became weapons in this ideological fight between, the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. The Cold War wasn't just about, military stuff. It was about ideas, culture, winning hearts and minds.
Totally. So get ready for some surprising stuff, because we're going to uncover how this era shaped Latin American identity, and I think in ways a lot of people might not expect.
What's really fascinating is that Latin America wasn't just some, passive bystander in all of this. They already had this, complicated relationship with the U.S.
Complicated is a good word.
Yeah, I mean, you've got economic ties, political influence. Sometimes it felt more like, a forced hug than a genuine partnership.
Definitely not a simple friends across the border situation. Okay, so let's set the scene. World War II just ended. The U.S. and Soviet Union are locked in this, ideological standoff.
Right.
And the U.S., they're already a major player in Latin America, and they're really determined to, keep the region from turning communist. Right?
Absolutely. It was a major concern for them.
But here's where it gets interesting. That very influence, the one the U.S. thought was, keeping Latin America close, was actually causing a lot of resentment.
It backfired, yeah.
Big time. And artists, they picked up on this. Guys like Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist, his work, it became a voice for that resentment.
Rivera. Powerful stuff. His murals weren't just, pretty pictures. They were full of social commentary, often depicting the struggles of the working class. And
he wasn't shy about calling out what he saw as U.S. imperialism.
Oh, absolutely not. He was very direct.
Now, Rivera was a member of the Mexican Communist Party.
Yeah, so he wasn't exactly trying to hide his political leanings.
Not at all. His art, it was bold and unapologetic. He really believed that the U.S. was exploiting Latin America, and those murals, they became this powerful visual indictment of U.S. policies.
Fascinating how art can be such a direct form of protest.
Right. It's okay, we've got this famous artist taking on a superpower. It's almost like David and Goliath, but with paintbrushes instead of slingshots.
Love that analogy.
Yeah.
And the U.S. wasn't the only one with artistic champions. You've also got Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet.
Oh, yeah, Neruda.
Staunch communist. He used his poetry to address, social injustice. And what he also saw is U.S. imperialism in the region.
And his involvement with that Soviet-backed World Peace Council, that definitely put him, firmly on the other side of the ideological fence.
For sure. It was a very clear stance.
And just like Rivera's murals, Neruda's poetry, it really connected with people who felt, marginalized, exploited. It just fueled that anti-U.S. sentiment even more.
It gave a voice to those frustrations.
It did. So Rivera and Neruda, they were obviously big names, but they weren't alone. They were part of this much larger leftist movement that was gaining steam across Latin America.
A whole generation questioning the status quo.
And what's interesting is that some of the things the U.S. was doing, they thought it was, containing communism, but it was actually pushing Latin America further away.
Almost like they were adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. I mean, the U.S., they supported some pretty repressive anti-communist regimes in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Chile. These actions, they just made the U.S. look like a bully,
Like they were more interested in control than actual democracy.
Exactly. And you can see how that would create this real problem for some people in the Latin American left. On the one hand, they wanted to fight these oppressive regimes, but then they saw the U.S. as supporting those regimes.
It was a really complex and, frankly, frustrating situation.
And then into this already messy situation, the U.S. decided, okay, we're going to launch this cultural counteroffensive. They weren't about to let the Soviets, win over Latin America without a fight.
They had to respond somehow. It was a battle for influence on all fronts.
So how'd they plan to fight back with culture? Did they send Elvis down for a goodwill tour or something?
Not quite Elvis, but they did recognize the power of culture, for sure. They knew it could shape opinions. And so they created this thing called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF.
CCF. Okay, what was that all about?
On the surface, it seemed like they were all about free expression. They held conferences, they funded publications, supported artists and intellectuals.
That's
But
very but coming.
there is. This supposedly independent organization, it was secretly funded by the CIA. Their real mission was to push pro-American, anti-communist ideas.
So not exactly a neutral platform for artistic expression then?
Nope, not really. It was a key part of their strategy to counter Soviet influence. Very. And I bet this secret funding didn't exactly help with those who were already suspicious of the U.S., right?
Oh yeah, it added fuel to the fire for sure. Just made it seem like the U.S. was manipulating things to push their own agenda.
Exactly. And then you've got this other layer of tension, the U.S. trying to win people over with this cultural diplomacy, but at the same time supporting these, well, repressive regimes.
Yeah, that's not going to win hearts and minds.
Definitely not. And to make it even more complicated, you had the Cuban Revolution simmering in the background.
Ah, yes.
It officially happened in '59, which is outside of our essay's time frame, but
But the seeds were planted way earlier.
exactly. It was brewing under the surface during those years.
It's like all these Cold War tensions, they created this pressure cooker, and Cuba was about to,
Explode.
Exactly. And when it did, it had a huge impact on the whole region, changed everything, the political landscape, the culture.
A seismic shift.
But we'll get to that later. Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here. The U.S. trying to win over Latin America with this, cultural diplomacy, but at the same time, their actions are causing resentment. And it's all happening with this, looming shadow of the Cuban Revolution.
It's a powder keg, for sure. It's kind of wild when you think about it. The U.S. and Soviet Union, they're locked in this huge rivalry.
Total opposites.
But they both saw culture as, a weapon in the Cold War. It wasn't just about, armies and bombs.
It was about winning over people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Winning hearts and minds. And each side had their own, playbook for how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S., they really leaned into this idea of, individual freedom, democratic values, opportunity, the American dream.
Yeah, all that.
They wanted to showcase this, vibrant, successful society, especially compared to what they portrayed as, the gloomy reality of life under Soviet rule.
So it was all about painting this picture of happy families, big industries, jazz music playing everywhere. That classic American image.
Exactly. That was the vibe. They wanted to make American culture seem irresistible, use it to subtly influence people and build support for U.S. policies.
Ah, so it was like this soft power play.
Exactly. Soft power.
Clever. So while Diego Rivera is painting these huge murals, critiquing U.S. influence.
Right. At the same time.
The U.S. is busy promoting a totally different image of themselves.
Yep. It was a battle of images, for sure. And the Soviets, they had their own approach. They focused more on amplifying voices that, lined up with their communist ideology.
So they're supporting artists and writers who were critical of capitalism.
Exactly. Especially those who, highlighted the struggles of the working class.
So they weren't necessarily showcasing Soviet culture, but rather they were.
They were backing anyone who challenged Western dominance.
Right. It was all about promoting this, global message of anti-imperialism, social justice, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They saw artists and intellectuals as potential allies in this fight against what they saw as, Western exploitation.
So you can see how this would be super tricky for Latin American artists and intellectuals.
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't just oh, I like this style better than that style.
Right. It was way more complicated.
It was about ideology,
Right.
politics.
And which side you aligned with. It could have real consequences.
Serious consequences. It could affect your career, your social standing. You could even be targeted by these repressive regimes we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. It was a risky situation. A lot of pressure.
It's hard to imagine having to weigh your creative expression against your own safety.
Yeah.
And the safety of your family.
Tough choices.
Yeah.
But despite all that, Latin American artists, they created some truly amazing, powerful work during this time.
Which is really incredible when you think about it. They were channeling all this tension, all these anxieties into their art.
And it really highlights why understanding the historical context is so important. We can't fully appreciate their work without knowing what was going on at the time, The politics, the culture, all of it.
It's like we were saying earlier, art doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's always a reflection of the world around it.
Always. And speaking of different perspectives, we have to talk about the historians who have, tried to make sense of all of this.
Right. Trying to figure out what the Cold War's impact on Latin America really was. Our essay talks about 4 main schools of thought.
4 different ways of looking at the same events.
And each one, it offers a unique lens, a different way of interpreting what went down.
Exactly. So first, you have the Orthodox school. They generally see U.S. intervention in Latin America as, necessary.
Necessary to do what?
To stop the spread of Soviet influence.
Yeah.
They argue that, sure, maybe some U.S. actions were a bit harsh, but...
But ultimately they were justified.
Right. Because in their view, it was all about fighting this greater threat, this communist menace.
Okay, so they're more forgiving of the U.S., seeing their actions as a necessary evil, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Then you've got the revisionists. They take a much more critical stance.
They're not buying it.
Not really. They see U.S. policies as, driven by self-interest. A desire to control the region, protect their economic interests.
So they're saying that the fear of communism was just, a convenient excuse?
Exactly. A way to justify propping up dictators, exploiting Latin America's resources, that kind of thing.
So the revisionists are pushing back against that whole we're the good guys narrative. They're saying, hey, the U.S. was in it for themselves.
Exactly. Then there are the post-revisionists. They try to find, a middle ground.
A more balanced view.
Right. They acknowledge that things were complicated, that both the U.S. and the Soviet Union had their own agendas, and that, Latin American countries, they weren't just helpless pawns in all of this.
So they're emphasizing that Latin American countries had their own agency, their own ability to make choices and shape their own destinies.
Yes. They weren't just passive bystanders.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, you have the New Left historians. They're really interested in the whole idea of revolutionary culture.
Especially after the Cuban Revolution.
Exactly. They see the Cuban Revolution as this symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for people who wanted, real social justice, true independence.
But they're not, totally uncritical of Cuba, are they? I mean, Cuba wasn't exactly a model of freedom and democracy.
True. The New Left historians, they recognize that Cuba's embrace of Soviet-style communism, it came with its own problems.
Right, a whole other set of issues.
It's fascinating how all these different historical interpretations, they really change how we see the past.
All right, it's like looking at the same event through different colored glasses.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history isn't about finding, one single answer. It's about this ongoing conversation, this debate about how we understand the past and what it means for us today.
So we've got artists like Rivera and Neruda. They're taking on superpowers with their art. We've got the U.S. and Soviet Union. They're fighting this cultural war for, the hearts and minds of Latin America. And then you've got all these historians. They're offering different interpretations of what it all means.
That's a lot to process.
It is. But it's important to remember that this isn't just some, abstract history lesson. This stuff had real consequences, and those consequences are still being felt today, especially in the relationship between Latin America and the U.S.
It's a legacy that continues to shape the present.
Okay, so let's connect all of this back to the present. How are those Cold War tensions, how are they still playing out today? It really is amazing how these events from, way back then still have such a big impact. So specifically, what are some of the ways those Cold War tensions are still affecting things between Latin America and the U.S.?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is, there's still a lot of distrust. In many parts of Latin America, people are just suspicious of the U.S.'s motives.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it goes back to, those interventions we were talking about.
Right.
The U.S. supporting these repressive regimes.
It's like that whole Big Brother image, the U.S. meddling in their affairs.
Right, and it's hard to shake that image even now. So yeah, building trust, it's definitely a challenge.
I bet. And that distrust, it probably pops up in all sorts of ways. Maybe it affects how they make political decisions or what kind of foreign policies they support.
Absolutely. It can influence everything.
Yeah.
And even, art. It can inspire artists to create work that's, directly challenging U.S. influence.
That's interesting, though, because it's not like everyone in Latin America views the U.S. negatively, right? There are plenty of people who see the U.S. as a good partner. They want more trade, more investment, even more cultural exchange.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely not a simple, good versus bad situation.
Yeah, it's complex.
It's super complex. And we can't forget that, there's no single Latin American perspective on this. Every country, every community, they have their own history, their own experiences with the U.S.
Which actually kind of reminds me of those different reactions we saw from Latin American artists during the Cold War. Some of them, they were really drawn to U.S. culture, They saw it as a good thing, a path to progress.
Right, but others?
Others saw it as a threat, like a form of cultural imperialism.
Exactly. And that struggle, to define their own cultural identity, to break free from both U.S. and European influence. That's still a major theme in Latin American art and literature today.
Wow, it all connects, doesn't it? So after really getting into this period, I mean, what are the most important things we should take away from all of this? What do we want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that culture. It's never neutral.
Never.
It's always tied up with politics, power, people's hopes and dreams.
It's like what we were saying earlier. Art doesn't exist in some bubble.
Right. It's a product of its environment. So to really understand art, especially art from like a really charged period like the Cold War.
You have to understand the context.
Exactly. The anxieties, the hopes, the whole thing. And another key takeaway. The Cold War might be over, but its legacy, it's still here, especially in places like Latin America.
Yeah, it wasn't just some political event that happened and then poof, it's gone.
Right. It was this huge cultural and psychological phenomenon that shaped how entire generations see the world.
Yeah.
And honestly, how we understand the Cold War, it's going to keep evolving as time goes on.
And that makes me think, like, how will people in the future view this period? You know, will they focus on the, like, political stuff, the wars, the threat of nuclear annihilation?
Good question.
Or will they focus on, I don't know, those stories of cultural resistance, the art, the music, the literature that came out of that time?
Interesting. It really shows how, like, history itself is dynamic. It's not just this fixed story.
It's a conversation, always changing.
Exactly. And engaging in that conversation, like really grappling with all the messiness of history,
Yeah.
that's so important if we want to, learn from it, build a better future.
Well said. Well, I think we've covered a ton of ground today. We looked at how the Cold War impacted Latin America, how artists got pulled into this, like, battle of ideas, and how that whole struggle for cultural identity is still going on today.
Lots to think about.
It has been an amazing journey, and we hope you enjoyed exploring all of this with us.
Thanks for joining us. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and
Keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.